This is a topic definitely very relevant to our audience, but where do you begin the advocacy efforts to have a law against sexual harassment for the entire continent of Africa?
Well, where we begin is really with the report itself, because this report covers 22 countries and 22 African countries, looking at what the legal framework is with regard to sexual harassment. How many countries actually have laws? Do they require organizations, institutions to have policies? And we see very clearly that there are very, very weak legal frameworks. There are very, very weak protections, very weak mechanisms. Many of the countries don't have much on the ground. So we're seeing that there's a need for us not just to look at individual countries, but to come together and have a regional approach.
Now, what's your advice to someone high up in the ranks who is actually afraid to tell someone else she is going through sexual harassment, perhaps from her supervisor, her boss, her employer? What would you say to such a woman?
I would say, especially if it's somebody of a high rank in a prominent position, think about the example that you need to set, because the most vulnerable, the poorest, the least educated, and so on, are also suffering from the same thing. And if someone in authority, someone in a higher position is actually able to speak out, then that opens up the conversation, because somebody who is below them is going to look up and say, okay, if she can speak out about it, if she has experienced it, then I can also speak out and do something. So that example and that inspiration, I think, is a very, very important thing.
Some of the stories we hear about very young people, they have just been employed. Some of them are intern, they're just girls coming out of school. And some of them are subjected to this kind of sexual harassment in terms of, oh, we're gonna keep you here, we're gonna give you a job and all of that stuff. But they are suffering within themselves. They are afraid to say something. What should they do?
It's very difficult if your livelihood and your bread and butter depends on it. But I think the more we have people speaking out, so speaking to somebody who is more neutral, not that immediate supervisor or that person who's perpetrating it, speaking to someone in authority and saying, this is what's happening to me. And if you're not prepared to do something, then I would like to take it further. I think that in itself just puts the employer or the person in the institution on terms, and hopefully will get them to act on it.
You've been working with, the continent on these issues, but there are obviously some countries that don't have any laws that enact that kind of, approach as to where people who are being sexually harassed should go. Do you think women lawyers and women legislators in certain African countries where these laws don't exist should decide this is the time to have a department within the government organizations that deals with sexual harassment?
Definitely there should be departments like this. There definitely should be initiatives, in a number of organizations. They actually appoint people that are dealing with issues of harassment specifically. But I think it's also important to make sure that that is grounded by number one, having legislation. So they should, as lawyers and as parliamentarians, push for laws to be in place, and also push for institutions to have policies, so organizations, companies, and so on, to have policies that actually recognize it and allow for complaints and action to be taken and for consequences for the perpetrators.
And if anyone listening, watching would like to reach out to you, how do they do that?
Okay, so they can get in touch with PALU, which is the Pan-African Lawyers Union, as well as AESHI. AESHI is on Twitter, it's on LinkedIn, and it has a website. The contact details are there, and also with the Cyrus R. Vance Center for International Justice. They're all online and on social media.